The evening air in Manhattan was crisp as Linda Hayes stood outside the grand Steinway Concert Hall, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She'd been standing there for almost 20 minutes now, just staring at the enormous glass doors and the well-dressed people flowing through them like a river of silk and diamonds. Her hands were shaking as she clutched a worn manila envelope against her chest. Inside was a letter, the paper soft and fragile from being read hundreds of times over the past 3 months. Her mother's handwriting, still so elegant and careful, filled every line of that letter with words that had brought Linda all the way from her small town in Ohio to this moment. Linda looked down at her own clothes and felt her stomach twist. She was wearing her best cardigan, the navy blue one she'd bought at a discount store 5 years ago. Her jeans were clean but faded, and her shoes were the comfortable kind that teachers wore when they spent all day on their feet. She taught piano to kids in her hometown, charging $20 an hour, barely making ends meet. She looked exactly like what she was, an ordinary woman who didn't belong in a place like this. Through the glass doors, she could see the lobby glittering with crystal chandeliers. Women in evening gowns glided across marble floors, their jewelry catching the light with every movement. Men in perfectly tailored suits laughed and shook hands, holding glasses of champagne that probably cost more than Linda's monthly grocery bill. She'd been saving for this trip for months. The bus ticket from Ohio, the cheap hotel room 6 blocks away, the single sandwich she'd eaten for dinner because everything in this neighborhood was so expensive. All of it for this moment, for the promise she'd made to her mother on that last terrible day in the hospital. Linda took a deep breath and pulled open the door. The warmth hit her first, then the sound of sophisticated chatter and classical music playing softly through hidden speakers. A woman in a sleek black dress stood behind a glossy podium near the entrance, checking names off a list. She had the kind of posture that suggested she'd never slumped in her life. Linda walked up to her, her worn sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished floor. "Excuse me," she said, her voice coming out smaller than she'd intended. The woman looked up and Linda saw her eyes do a quick scan from head to toe, the kind of look that takes in every detail and makes a judgment in less than a second. The woman's perfectly painted lips pressed into a thin line. "Can I help you?" The words were polite, but the tone wasn't. Linda swallowed hard. "My name is Linda Hayes. I know I'm not on the guest list, but I was hoping to speak to someone about the event tonight. I have a request and I know it's unusual, but it means everything to me." The woman's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Ma'am, this is a private charity gala. Tickets were $500 each and they sold out months ago. If you're looking to make a donation, I can direct you to our website." "No, I don't have that kind of money," Linda said quickly. My mother used to work here. She worked here for 20 years, and before she died, she asked me to do something. She asked me if I could play piano here just once in this hall. I know it sounds crazy, but I promised her I'd try." The woman's expression shifted from polite dismissal to something closer to disbelief. "Your mother worked here? In what capacity?" Linda felt heat rising in her cheeks. "She was on the cleaning staff. She worked nights after all the concerts were over." The woman actually laughed, a short, sharp sound that made Linda flinch. "Let me understand this correctly. You want to perform at one of the most prestigious concert halls in New York City because your mother was a janitor here?" Several people nearby had stopped talking and were turning to look. Linda felt their eyes on her, felt the weight of their expensive clothes and confident postures. She wanted to run, to disappear through those glass doors and never come back. But she thought of her mother's face in that hospital bed, so pale and thin but still smiling as she pressed this envelope into Linda's hands. "Promise me," her mother had whispered. "Promise me you'll play there just once. For both of us." "Yes," Linda said, lifting her chin slightly. "That's exactly what I'm asking." The woman shook her head slowly, almost in wonder at Linda's audacity. She turned to her assistant, a young man in a crisp white shirt, and said something Linda couldn't quite hear. But she caught the words security and escort her out. "Please," Linda said, her voice urgent now. "I don't need much time. Just 5 minutes. 3 minutes. I can play one piece, that's all. My mother spent 20 years in this building and she never asked for anything. This is the only thing she ever wanted." By now a small crowd had gathered. Linda could see them clearly. A woman in a red dress with diamonds at her throat whispering to her companion. A group of men in tuxedos looking amused. A couple holding champagne glasses, their faces showing that mixture of pity and secondhand embarrassment that people get when they witness someone else's humiliation. "This is precious," someone said, not quite quietly enough. "Does she actually think they'll let her play?" "Probably can't even read music," another voice added. A tall man in an expensive tuxedo separated himself from a group near the entrance to the main hall. He had the kind of face that suggested he was used to being the most important person in any room. His dark hair was swept back perfectly, and when he walked, people automatically moved aside for him. "What's going on here?" he asked the woman at the podium. She rolled her eyes. "This woman seems to think she can perform tonight. Her mother was a janitor here, apparently, and she believes that entitles her to play at our gala." The man turned to look at Linda, and she saw something flicker across his face. Amusement, maybe, or curiosity about what someone like her was doing in a place like this. "You play piano?" he asked. Linda nodded. "I do. I teach it, actually. Back home in Ohio." "Let me guess," he said, and there was definitely amusement in his voice now. "You teach children. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, and Mary had a little lamb and all that?" Some people in the crowd laughed. Linda felt her face burning, but she held his gaze. "I teach students of all levels. And yes, sometimes that includes beginners. Everyone starts somewhere." The man smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "I'm Daniel Rost. Perhaps you've heard of me. I've performed at Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center, and yes, here many times. I've studied with some of the greatest pianists in the world. And you're telling me you want to perform here tonight?" "I'm not trying to compete with anyone," Linda said quietly. "I just want to honor my mother's memory. That's all." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then turned to the woman at the podium. "You know what? Let her play before my performance starts. Give her 5 minutes." He looked back at Linda. "Consider it a warm-up for the real music." The crowd around them was growing larger now. Linda could see people pulling out their phones, already recording. She knew what they were thinking, what they were expecting. They thought this would be entertainment, a spectacle, something to laugh about later. The woman at the podium looked uncertain. "Mr. Frost, are you sure? The program is carefully timed and I'm sure," he said firmly. "In fact, I insist. This should be memorable." More laughter rippled through the crowd. Linda stood there, the envelope still pressed against her chest, and realized what she'd just agreed to. In a few minutes, she would walk out onto that stage in front of all these people who were already laughing at her, who had already decided she would fail. But she'd made a promise, and some promises are worth keeping, no matter how much they cost. A young woman in a staff uniform appeared at Linda's elbow. She couldn't have been more than 22, with kind eyes that stood out in this sea of judgment. "Come with me," she said softly. "I'll take you backstage." Linda followed her through a side door, away from the crowd that was still murmuring and laughing. The hallway was dimmer, lined with photographs of famous performers who had graced this stage over the decades. Linda recognized some of the faces from her old piano textbooks and music history classes. "I'm Beverly," the young woman said as they walked. "I work here part-time while I'm in college. I just want you to know. Don't let them get to you. They don't know anything about you." Linda managed a weak smile. "Thank you. That's kind of you to say. Did your mother really work here?" Beverly asked. "For 20 years, Linda replied, her voice catching slightly. "Every night from 10 until 6 in the morning. She'd come home just as I was waking up for school, smelling like floor polish and lemon cleaner, but she was always smiling, always humming music." Beverly stopped walking and turned to face her. "What was her name?" Grace Hayes." Something flickered in Beverly's eyes. "Recognition, maybe. I think I remember her. I've only been working here for 2 years, but there was a woman. She used to hum while she worked. Classical pieces. She knew every composer, every famous performance that had happened in this hall." "Is that her?" Linda's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, that's her. She was lovely," Beverly said quietly. "I'm so sorry for your loss." They'd reached the backstage area now. Linda could hear the crowd gathering in the main hall, the scrape of chairs, the rising buzz of hundreds of conversations. Her hand started shaking again. "You're going to be fine," Beverly said, squeezing her arm gently. "I'll be right here in the wings if you need anything." Linda nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She found a corner away from the stagehands rushing around with last-minute preparations and carefully opened the envelope. Her mother's letter was inside, along with an old photograph. The photo showed a young woman, maybe 18 years old, sitting at a piano. She was beautiful with bright eyes and a smile that lit up her whole face. She wore a simple but elegant dress and her hands were poised over the keys like she was born to play. On the back, in faded ink, it said, Juilliard Audition Day, 1989. Linda had seen this photo 1,000 times, but it still made her heart ache. Her mother had been so young, so full of dreams. She'd been accepted to Juilliard, one of the best music schools in the world, full scholarship, everything ahead of her, and then she'd gotten pregnant with Linda, 19 years old, unmarried, with a family that called her a disgrace and cut her off completely. The scholarship disappeared. The dreams died. And Grace Hayes spent the next 35 years cleaning buildings instead of performing in them. 5 minutes, someone called out. 5 minutes until we start. Linda carefully folded the letter and photograph back into the envelope. Her heart was racing so fast she felt dizzy. She could hear Daniel Frost's voice from somewhere nearby, talking to someone about the program, about his upcoming performance of Chopin's most complex pieces. Can you believe they're actually letting her play? She heard him say, followed by a laugh. This is going to be the most unintentionally hilarious thing that's happened here in years. I almost feel bad for her. Almost. Linda closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought about all those nights as a child, being woken up by her mother coming home from work. How Grace would sit on the edge of Linda's bed, still in her cleaning uniform, and tell her stories about the concert hall, about the music that had played there, about the great performers who had stood on that stage. Someday, her mother would whisper, "You're going to play there too. You have a gift, Linda, a real gift. Don't waste it like I did." "You didn't waste anything, Mom," Linda would always reply, but Grace would just shake her head sadly. "I let life scare me. I let other people's opinions matter more than my dreams. Promise me you won't do that. Promise me you'll be braver than I was." "Places," the stage manager called out. "We're starting in 2 minutes." Beverly appeared at Linda's side again. "Are you ready?" Linda stood up, her legs feeling like water beneath her. "I don't know. I don't think I've ever been less ready for anything in my life." "What are you going to play?" Beverly asked. "Rachmaninoff, Piano Concerto No. 2. Beverly's eyes widened. That's one of the hardest pieces in the repertoire." "Are you sure? Maybe you should start with something simpler. Something that won't—" "It was my mother's favorite," Linda interrupted. "She used to play it for me when I was little. Before everything fell apart for her, before she had to give up music, this was her signature piece." The stage manager appeared, clipboard in hand, looking annoyed. "You're the one who's playing first. Let's go. We're already running behind schedule because of this situation." Linda walked toward the stage entrance and suddenly she could hear the crowd. There had to be at least 500 people out there. Maybe more. She peeked through the curtain and saw them all, dressed in their finest clothes, sitting in plush red seats that probably cost more than her car. And then she saw her mother. Not really, of course, but in her mind she saw Grace Hayes sitting in the back row wearing her cleaning uniform, smiling that beautiful smile. Believing in her daughter the way she'd always believed in her. Daniel Frost brushed past her, deliberately bumping her shoulder. "Try not to embarrass yourself too badly," he said, just loud enough for her to hear. Though I suppose that's unavoidable at this point. The stage manager was counting down now. 30 seconds. "Get ready." Linda could see people in the audience pulling out their phones. She knew what they were doing. Getting ready to record her failure. Getting ready to post it online, to make it viral, to turn her mother's dying wish into a joke that thousands of people would laugh at. 15 seconds. Her hands were shaking so badly now that she had to clasp them together. Her mouth was dry. Her heart felt like it might actually break through her rib cage. 10 seconds. 9. 8. She thought about turning around, just walking away, getting on a bus back to Ohio and pretending this never happened. Her students wouldn't know. Her neighbors wouldn't know. She could go back to her small, safe life and forget about this humiliation. 3, 2, but then she thought about her mother's face in that hospital bed, the way Grace had gripped her hand with what little strength she had left, the desperate hope in her eyes when she'd made Linda promise, "One, go." The curtain opened and suddenly Linda was walking out onto the biggest stage of her life. The lights were blinding. The crowd's chatter dimmed but didn't stop completely. She could hear whispers, giggles, the click and beep of phones recording. The piano sat in the center of the stage, enormous and gleaming under the lights. It was a Steinway Model D concert grand, worth probably $250,000. The same piano her mother had cleaned and polished 5 nights a week for 20 years. Linda walked toward it slowly, her worn sneakers silent on the stage floor. Someone in the audience laughed. Someone else shushed them, but not very seriously. She reached the piano and sat down on the bench, adjusting it slightly. The keys gleamed in the light, pristine and perfect. She placed her hands on them, and they were cool and smooth under her fingers. The crowd was still talking. Daniel Frost stood in the wings, arms crossed, that smug smile still on his face. The woman from the podium sat in the front row, checking her watch impatiently. Linda closed her eyes. She pressed the envelope against her heart one more time, then set it carefully on top of the piano where she could see it, and then she began to play. The first notes rang out across the concert hall, and something happened that Linda hadn't expected. The room went silent. Not gradually, not politely, but instantly, as if someone had pressed a mute button on 500 conversations all at once. The opening of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 is unmistakable. Those deep, resonant chords that sound like church bells calling across a frozen Russian landscape. Linda's hands moved across the keys with a certainty that surprised even her. The nervousness that had been eating at her insides just moments ago seemed to evaporate the instant her fingers touched the piano. In the wings, Beverly's mouth fell open. Daniel Frost's smug expression flickered, confusion crossing his face. The woman from the podium sat up straighter in her seat, her phone forgotten in her lap. Linda didn't notice any of them. She was somewhere else now, somewhere far away from this concert hall and these judgmental strangers. She was 7 years old again, sitting next to her mother on the ancient upright piano in their tiny apartment, her mother's hands guiding hers, showing her how to stretch for the wider intervals, how to let her wrists flow naturally, how to make the piano sing instead of just play notes. Music isn't about hitting the right keys, her mother used to say. It's about feeling every single note in your heart and letting that feeling travel through your arms, through your fingers, into the instrument. The piano has to become part of you. The melody emerged now, that achingly beautiful theme that Rachmaninoff wove through the entire piece. Linda's right hand danced across the higher registers while her left provided the rich, rolling accompaniment. The technical difficulty of the piece was immense, but her fingers never faltered. They knew where to go, had known for years, decades even. Someone in the audience gasped. The sound was small but audible in the profound silence that had fallen over the hall. Daniel Frost took a step forward from the wings, his eyes narrowing. He knew this piece intimately. He'd performed it himself dozens of times in concert halls around the world, and he was hearing something now that made his chest tighten with an emotion he didn't want to name. She wasn't just playing the notes correctly. She was interpreting them with a depth and maturity that most pianists spent lifetimes trying to achieve. The music built to the first major crescendo, and Linda's entire body moved with the rhythm. Her shoulders swayed, her back arched slightly, her feet worked the pedals with precise timing. The piano responded to her touch like it was alive, producing sounds that ranged from thunderous fortissimos to whisper-soft pianissimos. In the audience, an elderly man leaned forward in his seat. His name was Robert Chen, and he'd been attending concerts at this hall for over 40 years. He'd heard some of the greatest pianists of the 20th century perform on this very stage, and what he was hearing now made his eyes fill with tears. This wasn't just technical proficiency. This was artistry of the highest order. The young woman sitting next to him, his granddaughter Amy, whispered, "Grandpa, who is she?" "I've never heard of her." Robert shook his head slowly, unable to look away from the stage. "I don't know, but we're witnessing something extraordinary." The piece moved into its more complex middle section, where cascading arpeggios climb up and down the keyboard like waterfalls of sound. Linda's hands were a blur now, moving so fast they seemed to have multiple fingers. Each note was crystal clear, perfectly articulated, never muddy or rushed. The rhythm was absolutely precise, even as the tempo fluctuated with the natural rubato that Rachmaninoff demanded. Beverly stood frozen in the wings, tears streaming down her face. She was remembering something now. Late nights when she'd stayed after her shift to study, sitting in the empty lobby, and she'd heard piano music coming from the main hall. She'd always assumed it was one of the performers practicing. But now she wondered, had it been Grace? Had Linda's mother been playing this same piano after everyone else had gone home? Daniel Frost's hands had curled into fists at his sides. He was supposed to go on after this, supposed to dazzle the audience with his own virtuosity. But how could he follow this? A small voice in the back of his mind, a voice he'd been ignoring for years, whispered that he'd never played with this much soul, this much raw emotional truth. His performances were technically perfect, yes, but they were also carefully calculated, designed to impress rather than to move. The woman from the podium had completely forgotten about checking her watch. Her mouth was slightly open, her breathing shallow. She was thinking about the way she'd dismissed this woman, the contempt in her voice, the assumption that someone dressed in a cardigan and jeans couldn't possibly have anything of value to offer. Shame burned in her chest, hot and uncomfortable. Linda reached the part where the left hand has to jump across enormous distances on the keyboard, while the right hand maintains the melody line. It's a section where even professional pianists sometimes miss notes, where the physical demands of the piece become almost athletic. Linda's hands flew across the keys, never missing, never hesitating. Sweat had begun to form on her forehead, but her expression remained serene, almost peaceful. She was thinking about all those nights when her mother would come home exhausted from cleaning, her hands rough and red from chemicals and scrubbing, but Grace would still sit down at their old piano and play for an hour before finally going to bed. Music heals everything, she'd tell Linda. No matter how hard the day was, no matter how tired I am, when I play, I remember who I really am. The music swelled into another powerful climax, and now people in the audience were openly crying. A woman in the third row clutched her husband's hand. A young man who'd been recording on his phone slowly lowered it, forgetting all about social media, completely absorbed in the moment. The acoustics of the hall carried every nuance of sound to every corner, and the effect was overwhelming. Robert Chen wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. His granddaughter Amy sat transfixed, her classical music textbook from college forgotten on her lap. She'd been studying piano performance for 3 years, and in 3 minutes she'd learned more about music than all her classes had taught her. This was what her professors had been trying to explain when they talked about transcendent performance, about technical skill married to emotional depth. In the wings, a stage manager who'd been working at this hall for 15 years stood with his mouth open. He'd seen hundreds of performances, maybe thousands. He'd become somewhat jaded, truth be told. It was just a job to him now. But this reminded him why he'd fallen in love with live music in the first place. The piece moved into its famous romantic theme, the melody that's been used in countless films and commercials, but loses none of its power even through overexposure. Linda played it with such tenderness that it felt like she was telling a story, like the music was speaking in full sentences about love and loss and longing and hope. Daniel Frost realized his hands were shaking. He pressed them against his sides, trying to steady himself. In his mind, he was rapidly calculating, trying to figure out who this woman could possibly be. He knew all the major concert pianists. He knew the rising stars, the conservatory prodigies, the competition winners. But this woman? A self-described piano teacher from Ohio? It didn't make sense. People didn't just appear out of nowhere with this level of skill, unless they'd been hidden, unless they'd been overlooked, unless the world had never given them a chance to be seen. The music built toward the final movement, and Linda's playing became even more intense. Her whole body was involved now, rocking slightly with the rhythm, her face showing the emotional journey of the piece. The piano sang and wept and shouted and whispered under her hands. Beverly noticed something then. In the light from the stage, she could see the envelope Linda had placed on top of the piano. A photograph had slipped partially out of it. Beverly could just make out the image of a young woman at a piano smiling at the camera. And suddenly Beverly understood. This wasn't just a performance. This was a promise being kept. This was a daughter honoring her mother. This was love made audible. The final notes approached, those triumphant chords that bring the piece to its powerful conclusion. Linda's hands came down on the keys with perfect force, perfect timing. The sound filled every corner of the hall, seeming to shake the very walls with its intensity. And then silence. Complete, absolute silence. Linda's hands stayed on the keys for a moment, her head bowed, her breathing heavy. The envelope with her mother's letter sat next to her, a silent witness to this moment. For what felt like an eternity, nobody moved. The silence in the concert hall was so complete that Linda could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the sound of her breathing slowly returning to normal. She kept her head bowed, not quite ready to face whatever was coming next. Then someone started clapping. Just one person at first, somewhere in the middle of the audience. The sound echoed in the vast space like a gunshot. And then another person joined in, and another. And suddenly the entire hall erupted. People weren't just clapping. They were on their feet shouting, some of them crying openly. The applause was deafening, bouncing off the walls and ceiling, building into something that felt almost physical in its intensity. It went on and on, wave after wave of it, showing no signs of stopping. Linda slowly lifted her head and looked out at the sea of faces. Every single person was standing. The woman who'd dismissed her so cruelly at the podium had tears running down her face, clapping so hard her hands must have hurt. The man in the front row who'd been checking his watch earlier was whistling through his fingers. The elderly gentleman was wiping his eyes with a handkerchief while still managing to applaud. Beverly burst onto the stage from the wings, not caring about protocol or propriety. She threw her arms around Linda, who was still sitting at the piano bench, looking dazed and overwhelmed. "That was incredible," Beverly sobbed into Linda's shoulder. "Your mother would be so proud. So proud." Daniel Frost walked slowly onto the stage, his face pale, and his expression completely transformed from earlier. The smugness was gone. The condescension had vanished. He looked like a man who'd just had everything he thought he knew turned upside down. He approached Linda with something close to reverence, waiting until she stood up to face him. "I owe you an apology," he said, and his voice cracked slightly. "I owe you an apology that I don't even know how to begin to express. What you just did. I've spent my entire life studying piano, training with the greatest teachers in the world, performing in the most prestigious venues, and I have never, not once, heard anyone play like that." Linda didn't know what to say. She just stood there, still holding the envelope with her mother's letter, looking at this man who'd mocked her so viciously just half an hour ago. "Who trained you?" Daniel asked, and there was genuine wonder in his voice now. "Juilliard? Curtis? The Moscow Conservatory? You have to tell me. That level of technique, that interpretation, it's not just talent. It's years of world-class instruction." Linda's voice was quiet when she finally spoke. "My mother trained me." Daniel blinked. "Your mother? The woman who worked here as a janitor?" "She wasn't always a janitor," Linda said, and her voice grew stronger. "She was accepted to Juilliard when she was 18. Full scholarship. She was considered one of the most promising young pianists of her generation." The audience had finally quieted down enough to hear their conversation. Everyone was leaning forward, straining to catch every word. "What happened?" Daniel asked softly. Linda looked down at the envelope in her hands. "She got pregnant with me. It was 1989, and her family was very traditional, very religious. When they found out she was pregnant and unmarried, they disowned her, told her she was a disgrace. The shame of it made her withdraw from Juilliard. She lost the scholarship, lost everything." Beverly was crying again, her hand over her mouth. Robert Chen, the elderly man in the audience, stood up slowly, his face showing a mixture of shock and recognition. "She took the only job she could get," Linda continued. "Here, at this hall, cleaning floors, polishing this piano. Every night for 20 years after everyone went home, she would let me practice here. She taught me everything she knew, everything she'd learned before her life fell apart. She said if she couldn't perform herself, then at least she could make sure I could." Daniel ran his hand through his hair, looking shaken. "My God, all those years of talent just hidden, wasted." "Not wasted," Linda said firmly. "She poured all of it into me. Every lesson she would have learned at Juilliard, every technique she'd mastered, every bit of musical understanding she had, she gave all of it to me. That wasn't waste, that was love." Robert Chen was making his way to the stage now, moving as quickly as his elderly legs would allow. His granddaughter Amy tried to hold him back, but he shook his head. "I need to speak to her," he said urgently. "I need to know." He climbed the stairs to the stage, and people moved aside to let him through. Up close, Linda could see he was probably in his 80s, with white hair and kind eyes that were still sharp and alert. He stopped a few feet from her, studying her face carefully. "What did you say your mother's name was?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Grace Hayes," Linda replied. "Grace Ellen Hayes." Robert's face crumpled, and he had to steady himself against the piano. "My God, Gracie, I remember her." Linda's heart started pounding. "You knew my mother?" "I was the director of admissions at Juilliard," Robert said, and tears were streaming down his lined face now. 36 years ago, I personally reviewed her application. I was there at her audition. She played. He paused, struggling to speak. She played Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the same piece you just performed, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd heard in 20 years of reviewing applications. The hall was completely silent again. Everyone was watching this moment unfold. "I called her personally to tell her she'd been accepted," Robert continued. "I told her she had a gift that only came along once in a generation. I was so excited to see what she would become." His voice broke, and then she never showed up. We sent letters, tried to call, but we never heard from her again. I always wondered what happened, where she went, whether something terrible had occurred. "Something terrible did happen," Linda said quietly. "Me. I happened. I was the reason her life changed." "No," Robert said sharply, reaching out to grip her shoulders. "No, don't ever think that. Life happened. Circumstances happened. But you weren't the terrible thing. You were the reason she kept going, the reason all that talent didn't disappear completely from the world." Beverly handed Linda a tissue and she realized she was crying too. Actually, looking around the stage, everyone was crying. Daniel Frost had tears running down his cheeks. The stage manager was wiping his eyes. Even the normally stern-faced woman from the podium was sobbing quietly. "Your mother's gift lives on in you," Robert said. "Everything she could have been, everything she should have been, I heard it in your playing tonight. She didn't waste her talent. She invested it. In you." Amy, Robert's granddaughter, had made her way to the stage as well. "I'm a piano student at Juilliard right now," she said to Linda, "and I just learned more from watching you play one piece than I have in 3 years of classes. You have to teach. You have to share this. The world needs to hear you." Linda shook her head. "I'm not a performer. I'm just a small-town piano teacher. I came here to keep a promise to my mother, that's all." "That's not all," Daniel said, and his voice was intense now. "You can't hide this. You can't go back to teaching in some small town and let this gift go unseen. Your mother spent her life in the shadows. Don't let her sacrifice be for nothing. Don't make the same mistake she did." "It wasn't a mistake," Linda protested. "She did what she had to do. She survived. She raised me." "Yes," Robert said gently, "and now you have a choice she never got to make. You can choose to share your gift with the world. You can choose to step into the light, not for yourself, but for her, for Grace. Let her be remembered not as a janitor who cleaned this hall, but as the brilliant teacher who created something magnificent." The woman from the podium had made her way onto the stage now, her mascara running, her composure completely shattered. "I'm Helen Pritchard," she said, her voice hoarse. "I'm the director of this venue, and I want to formally apologize for how I treated you earlier. It was inexcusable, unforgivable." Linda started to say something, but Helen held up her hand. "Please let me finish. We want to offer you a concert series here, 6 performances over the next year. We'll promote them, we'll fill every seat, and we'll pay you what you deserve. We'll also establish a scholarship in your mother's name, the Grace Hayes Memorial Scholarship, for talented musicians who might otherwise never get their chance." Linda felt dizzy. This was all happening too fast. Just an hour ago, she'd been standing outside, terrified and alone. Now she was surrounded by people offering her things she'd never even dreamed of. "I don't know," she whispered. "I need time to think. This is all so overwhelming." "Of course," Robert said kindly. "But please at least consider it. Your mother spent her life making sure you could have opportunities she never had. Don't throw them away." Linda looked down at the envelope in her hands one more time. She could almost hear her mother's voice, saying the words she'd said so many times over the years. "Promise me you'll be braver than I was." 3 months had passed since that night at the Steinway Concert Hall, and Linda still couldn't quite believe how much her life had changed. She stood backstage at that same venue, but this time everything was different. This time she was the scheduled performer. This time her name was on the marquee outside, lit up in elegant letters for everyone to see. The concert series that Helen had offered her wasn't just a polite gesture. They'd actually followed through. Tonight was her third performance, and like the previous two, every single seat had sold out within hours of tickets going on sale. The hall that had once seemed so intimidating now felt almost like home. Beverly appeared at her dressing room door, carrying a bouquet of flowers. She'd been promoted to assistant stage manager, partly because of her kindness to Linda that first night, and partly because Helen had realized they needed more people with heart working at the venue. "These just arrived," Beverly said, setting the flowers down on the vanity. "They're from a piano teacher in Idaho. She says she showed the video of your performance to all her students, and now 3 of them who were ready to quit have decided to keep playing." Linda smiled, touching the pedals gently. The video of that first performance had gone viral, just as she'd feared it would, but it hadn't become a joke like she'd imagined. Instead, it had become something else entirely. Millions of people had watched it, shared it, commented on it, not to mock her but to celebrate her, more importantly, to celebrate her mother. "How many flowers have arrived today?" Linda asked. 27 bouquets so far," Beverly replied with a grin. "And it's only 4 o'clock. We're going to need a bigger dressing room." There was a knock on the door and Daniel Frost poked his head in. He'd become an unlikely friend over the past few months. After that first night, he'd sought Linda out and asked if he could study with her, learn from her. The great Daniel Frost, who'd performed at Carnegie Hall and Lincoln Center, wanted to learn from a small-town piano teacher from Ohio. "Ready for tonight?" he asked, coming into the room. "The crowd is already lining up outside and it's still 3 hours until showtime." Linda nodded, but Daniel could see the nervousness in her eyes. He sat down in the chair across from her. "You know what the difference is between you and me?" he said. "I spent years learning how to impress people. You learned how to move them. That's why people line up to hear you play. That's why grown men cry during your performances. You're not performing for applause. You're performing for connection." "My mother taught me that," Linda said softly. "She always said music should make people feel something real. She said technique without emotion is just noise, no matter how perfectly you play the notes." Daniel smiled sadly. "I wish I'd met her. I wish I could thank her for what she gave to the world through you." There was another knock, and this time Robert Chen came in, leaning on his cane but moving with more energy than a man his age should have. His granddaughter Amy was with him as usual. Amy had become one of Linda's students, driving from Juilliard to Ohio twice a month for lessons. "I have something for you," Robert said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out an old photograph yellowed with age and handed it to Linda. She looked at it and gasped. It was her mother, even younger than in the photo Linda carried. Grace was sitting at a piano, probably at Juilliard, and she was laughing at something off camera. Her eyes were bright with joy and possibility. She looked so alive, so full of hope. "I took that picture the day she auditioned," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "I kept it all these years. I kept thinking maybe one day I'd find out what happened to her. Maybe I'd get to see her again and return it. I never imagined—" He trailed off, wiping his eyes. "I never imagined I'd be giving it to her daughter instead, after watching you honor her memory in the most beautiful way possible." Linda held the photograph like it was made of glass. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for remembering her, for seeing her talent when she was young, for giving her that chance even though she couldn't take it." "She did take it," Robert said firmly, "just not in the way any of us expected. She took that opportunity and transformed it into something even more remarkable. She created you." Helen Pritchard appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand, looking far different from the cold, dismissive woman she'd been 3 months ago. She'd made it her personal mission to make sure the Grace Hayes Memorial Scholarship became something substantial, something that would actually change lives. "I wanted to give you an update," Helen said, coming into the room. "We've raised enough money to fund 10 full scholarships for the first year. 10 young musicians who wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity will get to study at top conservatories, all because of your mother's story and your performance." Linda's eyes filled with tears. 10 students? And that's just the beginning, Helen continued. We're getting donations from all over the country. People who watched your video, who heard about Grace's story, who want to make sure talented kids don't get overlooked just because they don't have money or connections. She paused. One of the scholarship recipients is from your hometown in Ohio. A 16-year-old girl whose parents work 3 jobs to make ends meet. She plays piano at her church. Because of your mother, because of you, she's going to Berkeley next fall. Linda couldn't speak. She just nodded, tears streaming down her face. Beverly handed her tissues, laughing and crying at the same time. You're going to ruin your makeup, and we still have 2 hours before showtime. There's something else, Amy said, speaking up for the first time. She looked nervous but determined. I talked to my professors at Juilliard. They want to offer you a position. Not as a student, but as a faculty member, artist in residence and professor of piano. You'd be teaching the next generation of pianists. Linda stared at her. But I'm not qualified. I don't have a degree from a conservatory. I just teach kids in my living room. You're more qualified than half our current faculty, Amy said passionately. You have something most of them will never have. You know what it's like to struggle. You know what it's like to love music so much that you'll practice in an empty concert hall at midnight while your mother cleans floors. You know how to take raw talent and nurture it with patience and love. That's what teaching is supposed to be. Daniel stood up and put his hand on Linda's shoulder. Take the job. Inspire students the way your mother inspired you. Break the cycle of elitism and gatekeeping that kept Grace out. Make sure that never happens to another talented kid again. I don't know if I can, Linda whispered. What if I'm not good enough? What if I let everyone down? You already changed the world, Beverly said softly. You stood on that stage 3 months ago and showed everyone that talent and dedication matter more than expensive clothes or fancy credentials. You reminded people why music exists in the first place, not to make some people feel superior to others, but to connect us all to something deeper. There was a gentle knock and a young woman poked her head in. She couldn't have been more than 17, with nervous eyes and calloused fingers that marked her as a serious musician. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said quietly, but I had to meet you. I'm Claire. I'm one of the Grace Hayes Scholarship recipients. I'm the girl from your hometown. Linda stood up immediately and crossed the room. Claire, of course. Come in. Claire stepped inside, looking overwhelmed by all the important people in the room. I just wanted to say thank you. My whole life, people told me that music wasn't a real career, that I should focus on something practical. My high school counselor said kids like me don't get to be professional musicians. But then I saw your video and I read about your mother and I realized. She paused, struggling with emotion. I realized that stories like ours matter too, that we belong in these spaces just as much as anyone else. Linda hugged her tightly, and in that moment she understood what everyone had been trying to tell her. This wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't even really about her mother anymore. It was about every talented kid who'd been overlooked, every dream that had been dismissed, every person who'd been told they weren't good enough because of where they came from or how much money they had. I'll take the job at Juilliard, Linda said, turning to face the room. And I'll do the concert series. And I'll do whatever else I can to make sure my mother's story means something, to make sure her sacrifice changes things for other people. Robert smiled through his tears. Grace would be so proud. That night, Linda walked out onto the stage to thunderous applause. But before she sat down at the piano, she did something she'd started doing at every performance. She pulled out the old photograph Robert had given her and placed it carefully on top of the piano, right where everyone could see it. This is my mother, Grace Hayes, she said into the microphone. She was supposed to be standing here instead of me. But life had other plans. So tonight, like every night, I play for her. I play for every dreamer who never got their chance. I play for everyone who's been told they don't belong. She sat down at the piano and placed her hands on the keys. And as she began to play, she could swear she felt her mother's presence beside her, guiding her hands, sharing this moment that had taken 36 years and 2 lifetimes to arrive at. The woman they had mocked had revealed not just her own genius, but